November 18th, 1942. The German Sixth Army was on the verge of victory. The city of Stalingrad was a ruin. 90% of it was in their hands. After months of brutal house-to-house fighting, the end seemed just days away. But that night, in a frozen bunker miles behind the lines, a group of staff officers would uncover a simple mathematical truth, a truth that would prove their entire army was already doomed. Stay with us, and you will learn how 250,000 men were condemned not by a surprise attack, but by a set of numbers that their own leaders refused to believe. To understand their fate, we must go back 4 months, to the summer of 1942. The German war machine was rolling across southern Russia. Army Group South had shattered the Soviet defenses and was racing toward the rich oil fields of the Caucasus. It was then that Adolf Hitler made a fateful decision. He split his forces. One army would continue south to seize the oil. The other, the Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus, would turn east to capture the industrial city on the Volga River, Stalingrad. Many German commanders, including the chief of the General Staff, Franz Halder, saw the immense danger in this. To divide an army between two objectives hundreds of miles apart was to violate a fundamental principle of war. He argued for securing the oil first, then dealing with Stalingrad. But Hitler wanted both, and his will was absolute. For his dissent, Halder was dismissed in September. The path was set. By November, the men of the Sixth Army were veterans of a new, horrifying kind of warfare. They had fought their way into the city, only to see the battlefield shrink from vast plains to single, shattered buildings. The fighting was relentless, a meat grinder that consumed men and machines. A factory complex that would take minutes to walk through in peacetime became a fortress that took weeks to conquer. The city was a moonscape of rubble and dust, where every broken window could hide a sniper, and every pile of bricks could conceal a machine gun. Casualties were staggering, but General Paulus, a methodical and obedient commander, kept pushing his men forward. By the middle of November, they had done the impossible. The Soviet defenders were squeezed into a few small pockets along the western bank of the Volga River, their backs to the ice-choked water. German officers confidently wrote home that one final push would see the city fall. The red flag would be torn down, and the city bearing Stalin's name would belong to Germany. Then, they believed, they could finally rest. But on the vast empty plains to the north and south of the city, a different reality was taking shape. German intelligence was not blind. For weeks, reconnaissance flights had spotted Soviet forces massing on their flanks. They saw new divisions arriving, endless columns of trucks, and the dark shapes of artillery pieces being moved into position under the cover of darkness. The signs were there. A storm was gathering. Yet, the German High Command saw these preparations and drew the wrong conclusion. They assessed them as defensive measures or, at best, preparations for a small, local counterattack to relieve pressure on the city's defenders. The idea that the Red Army, which had been reeling from catastrophic losses for over a year, could possibly have the strength to launch a major offensive seemed absurd. Where would they find the men? The tanks? The guns? It was a failure not of intelligence, but of imagination. They could not conceive that their enemy was capable of such a recovery, or such a grand deception. The Soviets, for their part, had been masters of disguise. Since September, they had been executing a massive deception campaign known as Maskirovka. They created fake army groups near Moscow, broadcasting false radio traffic to make the Germans believe a major winter offensive was planned there, hundreds of miles to the north. Meanwhile, under the strictest secrecy and radio silence, they moved over 1 million soldiers, nearly 1,000 tanks, and more than 13,000 artillery guns to the plains around Stalingrad. They moved mostly at night, camouflaging their equipment during the day. It was one of the greatest logistical deceptions in military history, and it worked perfectly. This raises a quiet, unsettling question. How does a system built on precision and logic become blind to the truth right in front of it? When the belief in your own superiority is so strong, does it prevent you from seeing the enemy as they truly are? On the flanks of the Sixth Army were not elite German troops, but soldiers from Germany's allies, primarily Romania. These Romanian armies were given the thankless task of holding a long, exposed front line. They were brave, but they were critically under-equipped, lacking sufficient anti-tank guns, modern artillery, and the deep reserves needed to fend off a major assault. They were a thin, brittle line, holding the fate of the entire Sixth Army in their hands. Early on the morning of November 19, 1942, the first snows of the Russian winter began to fall. A thick fog blanketed the frozen landscape. The world was quiet, muffled, and still. Then, at 7:30 a.m., the silence was shattered. From thousands of hidden positions, the Soviet artillery opened fire. The barrage was of an intensity few had ever experienced. Over 3,500 guns targeted the Romanian positions in the north. The earth shook. The sky turned orange. Within an hour, the Romanian lines, their command posts, and their will to fight had been obliterated. And through the smoke and the fog, the dark silhouettes of hundreds of Soviet T-34 tanks began to advance, their engines a low, terrifying rumble that signaled the beginning of the end. The first reports reached 6th Army headquarters around 8 in the morning. They were fragmented, confusing. The Romanian lines were under heavy attack. Some positions had been overrun. General Paulus and his staff had faced Soviet counterattacks before. They were disruptive, costly, but ultimately manageable. The initial response was tactical, almost routine. Orders were issued for German reserve units to move up, to plug the gaps and stabilize the front. The situation, it was believed, was under control. But by noon, the map in the command bunker began to tell a different story. The red arrows representing Soviet advances were no longer just pushing forward. They were moving west with alarming speed, deep into the German rear. The Romanian fronts had not just been breached, they had disintegrated. Entire divisions had ceased to exist, and now Soviet tank formations were pouring through the gaps, not to relieve Stalingrad, but to race around it. The scale of the operation was becoming terrifyingly clear. This was not a counterattack, it was a trap. At the headquarters of Army Group B, Commander Maximilian von Weichs saw the bigger picture even sooner. His maps showed two massive Soviet pincers, one from the north, one from the south, swinging around the flanks of the Sixth Army, moving to meet each other far to the west. He realized instantly what was happening. He began preparing an urgent order for Paulus to break out immediately, to fight his way west while the arms of the trap were still closing. But before the order could be sent, a message arrived from Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. The Führer's standing orders were reinforced. There would be no retreat. German armies do not give up ground. Every position was to be held to the last man. Any encirclement, the High Command insisted, could be broken by a relief force from the outside. This doctrine had worked before, in smaller engagements earlier in the war. Hitler was certain it would work again. He could not, or would not, see that this time was different. The sheer scale of the Soviet operation dwarfed anything the Germans had faced before. This wasn't a skirmish, it was an avalanche. And so, as evening fell on November 19th, the staff officers at 6th Army headquarters turned from the battlefield map to their notebooks. The fight was no longer just about tactics. It was about arithmetic. They began a grim calculation. How many men would be inside the pocket if the Soviet pincers met? They counted the divisions of the Sixth Army itself, over 250,000 soldiers. They added the remnants of the Romanian divisions that had been swept into the trap. They added the support staff, the engineers, the Air Force ground crews. The number climbed relentlessly. It passed 280,000. It approached 300,000. Then came the second calculation, the one that sealed their fate. An army of that size, even on starvation rations, required a bare minimum of 500 tons of supplies every single day: food, ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies. 500 tons, just to continue existing as a fighting force. The question was passed to the Luftwaffe liaison officer. Could they be supplied by air? The head of the German Air Force, Hermann Göring, had already given his answer to Hitler. He had boasted that the Luftwaffe could handle it. It was a promise born of arrogance and political ambition, completely untethered from reality. The officers in the bunker knew the truth. Germany's entire transport fleet on the Eastern Front consisted of around 500 Junkers, 52 aircraft, the workhorse of the Luftwaffe. Many were in poor condition, flying in the brutal Russian winter. One staff officer did the math aloud, and the silence in the room deepened with every word. Under perfect conditions, no bad weather, no Soviet fighter planes, no anti-aircraft fire, the fleet might, theoretically, deliver 300 tons a day. But conditions were never perfect. Realistically, accounting for losses, weather, and mechanical failures, they would be lucky to deliver 150 tons. The numbers lay bare on the table, cold and absolute. Needed, 500 tons. Possible, 150 tons. The daily deficit was 350 tons. The army would begin to starve and run out of ammunition from the very first day. There would be no relief. There would be no holding out. An army cannot fight when its soldiers are freezing to death and eating their last rations. It was not a matter of courage or willpower. It was a matter of logistics. This is the quiet, terrifying moment when a battle is lost, not on the field, but on a ledger. At what point does a soldier's duty to obey collide with the mathematical certainty of annihilation? The answer came from Paulus's chief of staff, General Arthur Schmidt, a man whose loyalty to Hitler was unshakable. He dismissed the calculations. The Führer had given his word. Reichsmarschall Göring had made a promise. A relief force would break through. The discussion was over. To question the outcome was to question the Führer himself, an act of defeatism. But the numbers did not care about loyalty. Major Joachim Wieder, an intelligence officer present at these meetings, later wrote of the atmosphere. "We sat there in silence," he recalled, "looking at the numbers. Every officer there understood what they meant. The Sixth Army was already dead. It just didn't know it yet. They had condemned over 250,000 men to a slow, agonizing death, not through a failure in battle, but through a failure to accept a simple, horrifying truth. The war, for these men, was no longer about victory. It was about survival, and the arithmetic on a piece of paper had just told them that survival was impossible. By the morning of November 20th, the situation had grown even worse. The Soviet armored columns had advanced another 20 miles. The arms of the encirclement were drawing closer by the hour, the gap to the west shrinking with terrifying speed. The window of opportunity for the Sixth Army to save itself was closing. It was now measured in hours, not days. General Paulus, finally grasping the full catastrophic scale of the disaster, sent an urgent message to Army Group Headquarters. In it, he formally requested permission to break out. He stated in clear terms that his army could still fight its way west, but only if the order was given immediately. Another day of delay, he warned, and escape would become impossible. His request was endorsed by his superior. General von Weichs, who forwarded it to Hitler's headquarters with his own strong recommendation for approval. For a few brief hours, a fragile hope flickered in the command bunker. Logic might still prevail, but the response, when it came, was a hammer blow. Hitler refused. The order from the Führer's headquarters was direct and unequivocal. The Sixth Army would hold its positions in Stalingrad at all costs. It was to become a fortress, a symbol of German will. Reichsmarschall Göring, the message repeated, had personally guaranteed an adequate supply by air. A relief force was being assembled. There would be no retreat. The message was filled with the usual rhetoric about the sacred soil consecrated by German blood and the duty of a soldier to stand and die. The senior officers received this order in stunned silence. The piece of paper they held in their hands was not a military command. It was a death sentence for every man under their command. Colonel Wilhelm Adam, an aide to Paulus, later described the atmosphere as surreal, like watching a play where everyone knew the tragic ending but was powerless to change the script. The confident, professional men who had led an army to the brink of victory were now hollow-eyed, their voices quiet, their movements slow. The cold, mathematical certainty they had discovered the night before was now official policy. It was in this moment of despair that the conflict shifted from a battle against the enemy outside to a battle of conscience within the German command. The most powerful voice of dissent belonged to General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, a fiery and respected corps commander. He argued passionately, desperately, that Hitler's order was not just wrong, it was insane. It violated every principle of military necessity. An order that knowingly and needlessly condemns an entire army to annihilation, he declared, is not a lawful order. He urged Paulus to disobey. He argued that a general's highest duty is not to a distant leader, but to the lives of the men entrusted to his care. Save the army first, he pleaded, and face a court-martial later. It was better to be a living defendant than a dead hero who had followed an absurd command. What is the value of obedience if its price is 250,000 lives? But Friedrich Paulus was a product of the old Prussian military tradition. He was meticulous, cautious, and above all, obedient. The thought of disobeying a direct order from his commander-in-chief was simply inconceivable to him. He had sworn an oath of personal loyalty to Adolf Hitler, and he would not break it. Some historians have seen this as a tragic form of honor, the act of a man bound by his code even when it led to ruin. Others have called it profound moral cowardice, a man who chose to sacrifice his army rather than defy his master. As the debate raged in the command bunker, the Red Army was finishing its work. On November 22nd, Soviet tank crews from the northern and southern pincers met near the town of Kalak, 60 miles west of Stalingrad. The encirclement was complete. The ring of steel was closed. Inside this pocket, a vast area roughly 40 miles across, were 284,000 German and Allied soldiers. They were trapped with hundreds of tanks that were now running low on fuel, thousands of artillery pieces with dwindling shells, and enough food for perhaps 2 weeks, if rations were cut immediately and drastically. The internal conflict came to a head on November 25th. General von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, seeing that Paulus would not act, decided to force the issue. On his own authority, he ordered the units in his corps to begin destroying heavy equipment they couldn't move and to start pulling back toward the western edge of the pocket in preparation for a breakout. It was a stunning act of defiance. For a moment, it seemed the army might save itself despite its commander. But word reached Paulus, who flew into a rage. He immediately sent a counter-order, threatening Seydlitz with a court-martial for treason. Discipline, that rigid spine of the German army, held. Seydlitz's officers obeyed Paulus, and the breakout attempt died before it began. The window had now slammed shut. The last chance, born of courage and desperation, had been lost to a failure of will. The Soviet forces now had time to dig in, to fortify the ring around the pocket, making any future breakout attempt exponentially more difficult and costly. The fate of the Sixth Army was now entirely dependent on the two promises made by the High Command, Göring's air supply and the coming of a relief force. Both, as the men in the bunker already knew from their calculations, were fantasies, but they were now the only hope left to cling to. By early December, the grim predictions of the staff officers had become the daily reality for the men inside the Stalingrad pocket. The promised air supply was a catastrophic failure. On the best days, a handful of planes made it through the gauntlet of Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire. On bad days, none came at all. The average daily delivery was less than 100 tons, a fifth of what was needed. Soldiers were subsisting on rations that provided barely 300 calories a day, a slow starvation diet for men fighting in temperatures that plunged to 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The last of the horses were slaughtered for meat. Ammunition was so scarce that firing was only permitted if an enemy attack was confirmed. Fuel was nearly gone. The tanks and vehicles that had not been destroyed were now just frozen steel statues. Wounded men died in makeshift hospitals for lack of bandages and medicine. The Sixth Army was no longer an army, it was a dying organism, slowly freezing and starving to death in a vast open-air prison. But far to the south, one last hope was gathering. Germany's most capable commander, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, was placed in charge of a newly formed Army Group Dawn. His mission was clear: launch an offensive, codenamed Operation Winter Storm, to break through the Soviet lines and relieve the trapped Sixth Army. Manstein was a brilliant strategist, a realist who understood the brutal mathematics of the Eastern Front. He assembled a powerful armored force, spearheaded by the LV Panzer Corps, and prepared to strike. Like the officers trapped in the pocket, Manstein did his own calculations and arrived at the same inescapable conclusion. The airlift had failed. The Sixth Army was doomed if it stayed put. Simply opening a corridor would not be enough. The Soviets would cut it again, and holding it open through the winter against overwhelming enemy numbers was impossible. The only viable plan was a coordinated operation. His relief force would fight its way to the pocket, and at the same time, the Sixth Army would have to fight its way out to meet them. They would abandon Stalingrad, save the men, and restore the German front line. He gave this breakout plan its own code name, Operation Thunderclap. But this required Hitler's approval, and Hitler remained immovable. The city bearing Stalin's name had become a symbol. German propaganda had broadcast its imminent capture to the world. To abandon it now would be a political humiliation he would not tolerate. And so, he gave Manstein a paradoxical order: relieve the Sixth Army, but the Sixth Army must not abandon Stalingrad. It was a command that defied geometry and logic. Manstein knew it was impossible, but he hoped that once his forces got close enough, the reality on the ground would force Hitler's hand. On December 12th, Operation Winter Storm began. German panzer divisions slammed into the Soviet forces, blocking the way. The fighting was savage, conducted in the midst of a blizzard. The German tankers and infantry pushed forward, clawing back mile after frozen mile. After a week of relentless combat, the spearhead of the relief force reached the banks of the Mishkova River. They were now just 30 miles from the southern edge of the Stalingrad pocket. For the starving, freezing men inside, this was a moment of resurrection. They could hear it, a low, distant rumble on the horizon. The sound of German artillery, the sound of their saviors. Officers in the pocket used binoculars to look south, and some swore they could see the flashes of the guns. Hope, which had been extinguished for weeks, surged through the ranks. They were not abandoned. Deliverance was at hand. Manstein knew he was at the absolute limit of his advance. His forces were exhausted, his supply lines were stretched thin, and powerful Soviet armies were already moving to attack his own flanks. He could go no further. It was now or never. He sent a radio message to General Paulus, a message carefully worded to give Paulus the justification he needed to act. He did not directly order the breakout, as that would be a clear violation of Hitler's command. Instead, he signaled that Paulus must begin Operation Thunderclap on his own initiative. The code phrase was sent, Winter Tempest. This was the final, critical moment of decision. The entire fate of the Sixth Army now rested on one man. But Paulus hesitated. His tanks, he calculated, had just enough fuel to travel about 20 miles, not enough to reach Manstein's lines with certainty. A breakout would mean abandoning thousands of wounded soldiers and all of their heavy equipment. It would be a desperate gamble. He radioed back, asking if the relief force could guarantee his supply if he broke out. He was asking for a certainty that no one could give. He was asking for permission, for absolution from the Führer, for an order that would relieve him of the terrible weight of responsibility. But that order would never come. Hitler, when informed of the situation, again forbade any breakout. And so, Paulus, paralyzed by his obedience and his own cautious nature, did nothing. He chose to follow his orders, even though he knew they meant certain destruction. On the other side of the river, Manstein waited. The hours ticked by, but no German columns appeared from the north. The radio from the pocket fell silent on the matter. The sound of the Sixth Army's guns, which would have signaled the breakout, never came. After 2 days of waiting, with Soviet forces closing in on his own army, Manstein had no choice. He had to pull his forces back. The relief attempt had failed. For the men in the pocket, the faint rumble of the guns to the south faded, and then disappeared, replaced once more by the whistling of the wind. The silence that followed was the sound of their last hope dying. Was this the ultimate failure of a single man, or the inevitable collapse of a system that valued blind obedience over human life? After the failure of Operation Winter Storm, the last flicker of hope was extinguished. The men of the Sixth Army understood they had been left to their fate. The radio broadcasts from Germany still spoke of their heroism, calling them the heroes of Stalingrad, who were holding a vital fortress. But for the soldiers on the ground, these words were a bitter mockery. They were not heroes in a fortress. They were prisoners in a frozen graveyard. The landscape itself had become an enemy. The constant moaning wind swept across the flat, featureless steppe, driving snow into every crevice and dugout. The world was reduced to shades of white, gray, and the dark stains of death in the snow. Life inside the pocket, or der Kessel, the cauldron, as the soldiers called it, degenerated into a primal struggle for survival. The battle against the Red Army continued, but it became secondary to the daily war against cold and hunger. The winter of 1942-1943 was one of the coldest on record. Temperatures frequently dropped to 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, with wind chills that could freeze exposed skin in under a minute. German soldiers who had begun the summer campaign in light uniforms were now woefully unprepared. They wore anything they could find, scraps of cloth, paper straw, stuffing it inside their greatcoats for insulation. Many lacked proper winter boots, and frostbite became a relentless enemy. Men would lie down to sleep in their crowded, lice-infested dugouts and wake up to find their feet had turned black and numb. The field hospitals, often no more than frozen cellars, were scenes of unimaginable horror. Without anesthetics, surgeons performed amputations on conscious men. Without bandages, wounds were dressed with paper. Diseases like typhus and dysentery, spread by lice and filth, swept through the ranks, killing men more quietly but just as surely as Soviet bullets. Hunger was a constant, gnawing presence. The daily ration, when it was available, shrank to a few ounces of bread, often made with sawdust to add bulk, and a thin, watery soup. Soldiers became walking skeletons, their faces hollow, their eyes sunk deep into their skulls. They developed what became known as the cauldron gaze, a vacant, thousand-yard stare that signaled the death of the spirit within. They scoured the rubble for anything edible, risking sniper fire to dig up the frozen carcasses of horses buried for weeks under the snow. There are grim, verified accounts of men driven to the final desperation of cannibalism, a horror that stripped away the last vestiges of their humanity. Discipline, once the unshakable foundation of the German army, began to fray and then snap. The rigid command structure dissolved into a hierarchy of survival. Soldiers formed small, tight-knit groups, hoarding what little food they had, and trusting no one outside their circle. The junior officers, the lieutenants and captains, were caught in an impossible position. They were tasked with enforcing orders from a distant, delusional command while watching their own men waste away. Many abandoned pretense and simply focused on trying to keep their small platoons alive for one more day. A black market emerged, where a single slice of bread could be traded for a handful of bullets or a family photograph. The airfields at Pitomnik and later Gumrak were the only links to the outside world, and they became symbols of both hope and despair. Every day, crowds of wounded and frostbitten men would gather, hoping for a spot on one of the few transport planes that made it out. But priority was given to specialists and couriers. For the ordinary wounded, there was little chance. They lay on stretchers in the snow for days, slowly freezing to death, watching the planes land, unload a few meager supplies, and take off again. The bitterness was compounded by the nature of the supplies that sometimes did arrive. On rare occasions, a container would be dropped that held not food or ammunition, but thousands of iron crosses or bundles of propaganda leaflets, a cruel and useless gesture that felt like a profound insult to the dying men. One of the more peculiar and tragic details of this period was the cauldron mail. The Luftwaffe planes that flew in supplies would also bring letters from home and take letters out from the soldiers. For men who had nothing left, a letter was a priceless treasure, a fragile link to a world of warmth, family, and sanity that seemed a universe away. They would write desperate, heartbreaking letters, often censoring their true condition, reassuring wives and parents that they were fine. But as the weeks wore on, the tone of the letters changed. The official censorship couldn't hide the despair. The final mail left the pocket in late January. The letters carried on that last flight were later found, unread by their recipients, and now serve as a final, haunting testament to the suffering of these men. Amidst the slow-motion collapse, the Soviets began the final phase of their operation. On January 10, 1943, they launched Operation Ring, the systematic destruction of the trapped German army. They unleashed a massive artillery barrage from over 7,000 guns, followed by an all-out assault of infantry and tanks. The German soldiers, weakened by starvation and cold, could offer little effective resistance. They had almost no ammunition for their heavy weapons and no fuel to move their tanks. They fought with rifles and machine guns until they ran out of bullets, and then they were overwhelmed. The pocket began to shrink day by day. The Soviets methodically squeezed the remaining German forces into smaller and smaller pockets within the ruined city. The fighting was no longer for strategic objectives. It was the final, convulsive struggle of a dying army. The world had shrunk to the size of a cold cellar, a ruined factory floor, a trench dug in frozen earth. Does an order to fight to the last man still hold meaning when there is nothing left to fight with and no purpose left to die for? For the men of the Sixth Army, this question was no longer theoretical. It was the only question left. By the last week of January 1943, the Sixth Army had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Soviet attacks had sliced the German-held territory into two small, isolated pockets within the ruins of Stalingrad. A southern pocket centered around the Univermag department store where Paulus had his headquarters, and a northern pocket in the area of the tractor factory. All organized command had broken down. It was no longer an army, but a collection of starving, frost-bitten men, huddled in basements and ruins, waiting for the end. Radio communication with Hitler's headquarters, however, was still active. From his bunker in East Prussia, hundreds of miles away, Hitler continued to demand resistance. He spoke of the verdict of history, of the immortal glory that would belong to the heroes of Stalingrad if they fought to the very last man, the last bullet. On January 30th, the 10th anniversary of his rise to power, Hitler sent one final, chilling message to General Paulus. He promoted him to the rank of Field Marshal. This was not an honor, it was a command. No German field marshal in history had ever surrendered. The message was implicit and understood by everyone in the bunker. Paulus was expected to take his own life. He was to die with his army, providing a final, glorious symbol for the propaganda machine back home. A heroic myth was to be built on the bones of 250,000 men. But in that frozen basement, surrounded by the stench of death and the quiet despair of his staff, Friedrich Paulus made his final decision. He had followed every order, obeyed every command that had led his army to this point of annihilation. He had refused to break out when it was possible. He had condemned his men to starvation and death in the name of obedience. But this last, unspoken order he would not obey. He would not give Hitler his symbolic suicide. On the morning of January 31st, 1943, Soviet soldiers cautiously approached the Univermag department store. They expected a final, desperate battle. Instead, they found a German officer who led them down into the basement. There, amidst the filth and the wounded, they found the newly promoted Field Marshal Paulus, who surrendered without a word. The end of the Sixth Army's southern pocket came not with a bang, but with a quiet, exhausted admission of defeat. 2 days later, on February the 2nd, the northern pocket under the command of General Karl Strecker also fell. His final radio message to the High Command was a testament to the long, agonizing ordeal. The Sixth Army, true to its oath and in recognition of the lofty mission of its Führer, has held its position to the last man and the last bullet for Führer and fatherland unto the end. Then the radio went silent. Of the nearly 300,000 men who had been trapped in the Stalingrad pocket, approximately 91,000 survived long enough to surrender. But for them, the suffering was far from over. What followed was a death march across the frozen steppe to primitive, ill-equipped Soviet prison camps. Weakened by months of starvation and disease, thousands died along the way. In the camps, conditions were horrific. Of the 91,000 who went into captivity, only around 5,000 would ever see Germany again. They returned years later, broken men, ghosts from a forgotten army. Historians still debate the final act of Friedrich Paulus. Why did a man who sacrificed his entire army for the principle of obedience choose to defy his leader's final, most personal wish? Was it a last, desperate assertion of his own will? A final flicker of responsibility for the lives of his surviving men? Or was it simply the choice of a man who was physically and spiritually broken, with nothing left to give, not even his own life for a cause he knew was lost? But the story of Stalingrad is larger than the story of one general. It is a timeless and terrible lesson about the conflict between truth and ideology. The fate of the Sixth Army was not decided on the battlefield. It was decided in the minds of leaders who chose to believe in willpower over arithmetic. It was sealed by a system that made it more dangerous to tell the truth than to repeat a lie. The staff officers in the bunker had known the truth on the very first night. They had seen the numbers. They knew the airlift was a fantasy and that holding out was impossible. Yet that simple mathematical reality was rejected because it did not fit the narrative of invincibility and heroic will. When truth becomes a form of dissent and reality is treated as an act of defeatism, the stage is set for catastrophe. Every empire built on the denial of facts, every system that punishes its truth-tellers, eventually meets its own Stalingrad. It will find itself trapped by a reality it refused to acknowledge, with no way out, waiting for a deliverance that will never come. The silence that fell over the ruins of Stalingrad on February 2, 1943, was not just the end of a battle. It was the sound of a lie collapsing under its own weight. Thank you for spending part of your day with us. If this story offered a moment of reflection, we hope you'll consider subscribing and joining us again for another journey into the past. Let us know in the comments what part of this story will stay with you the most.